In August of 2015, two experienced naturalist hikers, 25-year-old Cedric Blackmore and 33-year-old Basil Ashdown, hiked a trail in Glacier National Park and were scheduled to return in 3 days. At 6:42 p.m., their satellite terminal sent the last image: two smiling faces against the backdrop of Lake St. Mary and a darkening sky. Then there was silence. 3 years had passed, until former Ranger Luke Harrison, clearing a landslide near the abandoned gray rock quarry, pushed back a slab and peered into a black gap. It turned out to be a cave. Inside, there were the remains of missing people and walls covered with strange symbols, as if carved into the stone by someone. August 2015. Glacier National Park looked calm and familiar. Cedric Blackmore and Basil Ashdown walked into the St. Mary's Center that morning, according to the sign-in sheet. A worker remembers them as composed and polite. Cedric with a camera, Basil with a list of plants. They told us the route along the Harrison Creek Trail and indicated a duration of 3 days. From the family's words, we know that their equipment is in good condition, food is laid out by day, and they have a map and compass at hand. Hikers moving toward them saw them a few hours after the start. These details were included in the inspection materials. The latest contacts are from two sources. Public, a photo sent via a satellite terminal and posted on social media, with two smiles and a darkening sky against the backdrop of Lake St. Mary. Private, a short call to Cedric's sister. The only information we know is that everything is fine. The pace is slower because of the debris, and they plan to deviate from the main route to explore a lesser-known area, which they called Wind Canyon. Official maps do not contain this name. On the appointed day, communication was not restored. The relatives turned to the rangers. The search began in cooperation with the Flathead County Search and Rescue. A silver Toyota 4Runner SUV was parked at the trailhead. This was recorded in the report. Inside were folded clothes, map folders, empty phone holders, and wallets in the glove compartment. During the first hours, they worked on the sides of the route. The dog handlers followed the trail of Cedric's belongings to the boulder field, and then it was lost. A helicopter with a thermal imager did not help. Volunteers examined ravines and stream banks with chains. In the first few days, the results were meager. On the roadside, they found a piece of energy bar packaging with no usable prints. Cedric's friends recognized the brand, but experts did not recognize it as evidence of ownership. An old map with handwritten notes and a printout of the route from the visitor center were found in the glove compartment of the car. Both items were photographed and described. A separate search direction was laid in the direction of the conditional canyon of the winds. There, the paths are blurred, the space deceives. The wind moves in waves. Stone labyrinths hide dips. The search yielded no evidence of the couple's whereabouts. When a week passed without any results, the management announced the curtailment of the active phase. The formula remained in the reports: missing under unclear circumstances, likely deviation from the route, weather factor, rock and water hazard. The families were returned their property and contacts for further communication. The summary at this point is concise. Two experienced people came out prepared, recorded the path, and suddenly, silence. The car waited in the parking lot like a watchman without a voice. The materials contained names, dates, and coordinates without bodies and without a version that could be accepted. There was a brief note about the intention to inspect an unknown area, which would later determine the direction of the search. It has been 3 years since Glacier National Park last saw Cedric Blackmore and Basil Ashdown. During this time, not a single new page has appeared in the police file. The case under the official number was transferred to the archive of so-called cold cases. The protocols state that active search activities were suspended due to the lack of promising leads. For the relatives, this did not mean the end, but a long, silent wait when the days slow down and the years bring nothing but new appeals and helpless answers. Cedric's sister, Ava Blackmore, a Kalispell resident, continued her own search. In letters to the Parks Department, she repeatedly asked to resume surveying the area where she believed her brother might have gone. Her requests followed a standard formula. There are no sufficient grounds to resume the operation. She kept copies of all the refusals, written in flat, official phrases. The witnesses she interviewed on her own confused the dates over time, even the colors of their equipment. Some of the volunteers admitted that the search stopped in those days, not because of fatigue, but because of fear. The slopes were too steep, the stone streams too unpredictable. So gradually, the area of disappearance turned into a white spot, and the memory became the border between reality and imagination. When more than 3 years passed, Ava turned to a private investigator from Missoula. His name, Luke Harrison, appeared in the Ranger Service reports of the past years. A former employee who had left the service after an injury, but retained contacts and detailed knowledge of the mountain topography. It was he who agreed to take on the case that everyone else had abandoned. According to Ava herself, Harrison did not start with a map of the area, but with the study of the archive. He looked through copies of search party reports, logbooks, equipment descriptions, even samples of fonts on maps. The mention that interested him was in Basil's route, a short pencil note on the back of a printout. Possible deviation to Wind Canyon. This note has never attracted much attention because there was no such place officially. It is known that after reading this note, Harrison changed the direction of his search. He superimposed the data from old maps on modern satellite images and drew attention to a stretch between mountain spurs where, according to old geological documents, a stone quarry called Gray Rock once operated. The quarry was closed in the 90s, and the access roads were washed away. This place is not marked in tourist guides, so during the initial search, they did not go there. Harrison persuaded Ava to organize a small search team at his own expense. It included several volunteers he knew from his time in the service. They traveled in off-road vehicles using copies of geological maps that had been preserved in the state archive. The road to Gray Rock ran through abandoned sections of forest, where winds broke the tops of pine trees and abandoned drill holes pulled the smell of rust and diesel from the ground. While exploring the area, the group came across the remains of old metal containers, broken wires, and pieces of equipment. In the garbage, among the cans and empty bottles, one thing caught the eye: a tin can, rusty, but with a partially preserved label. The photos in Cedric's archive revealed that he often bought this particular brand of energy bars. The label was identified not by its barcode, but by its color combination and logo, which was no longer in production. For Ava, this was the first real proof that her brother could have been near the site. Experts she hired later confirmed that the can had been there for at least 3 years. No other fresh traces could be found. However, for Harrison, this was enough to draw a logical conclusion. If they had reached the quarry, they were probably looking for shelter from a sudden change in weather or trying to take a shortcut. He looked at geologic maps at the University of Missoula Library, where old mining plans were kept. In the margins of one map dating from the 1940s, there was a note of an unexplored sinkhole system located near the area of the former quarry. Harrison then turned to local residents. His descriptions coincided with the testimonies of several people. Hunters, truckers, and seasonal workers had seen unusual formations in the stone near Gray Rock that looked like cracks or narrow entrances to caves. One of the truckers, who often transported goods through Logan Pass, recalled that his older colleagues called these places Sleeping Bear Cave. The name is unofficial, but has been used among the locals since the 60s. At Harrison's request, the Parks Department confirmed that there are indeed records of old cavities in the area, but access to them is not regulated because the entrance is dangerous due to landslides. Since then, the site was considered closed. The search for information lasted several weeks. Harrison wrote the reports himself, briefly and clearly, without conclusions. The copies of the reports that Ava kept contained phrases like probable deviation from the route to the southeast, a quarry, cave with local legends. At the end of the last entry is a date, August 2018. It was in this month that the family received news from someone for the first time in 3 years that was not a guess, but a fact. To outsiders, it all looked like a coincidence. A can in the trash, a mention of a trucker, old maps gathering dust in the library. But for Ava and Harrison, these little things formed a chain. The logic led to one thing. If the two men were really near Grey Rock, then there might be something nearby that had gone unnoticed during the initial search. Among the marked coordinates in the reports is a narrow strip between the spurs of the hills, which is impossible to reach without special equipment. Harrison wrote down only 2 words next to it: check the cavities. The silence that had lasted for years finally cracked. The first sound appeared in it, not a voice, not a scream, but a faint but tangible echo that could lead to the answer that had remained underground for so long. September 2018. The weather in the northern part of the park was changeable, with short rains alternating with sunny spells, the wind from the pass carrying dust and the smell of wet stone. Luke Harrison's team left the camp early in the morning, leaving their cars by the road leading to the abandoned Grey Rock quarry. They had the standard caving equipment with them: helmets, ropes, gas lanterns, and a camera to document the search. Harrison himself, according to one of the volunteers, did not talk much. He was interested in details: wind direction, scree, slope structure. The search for the entrance lasted several days. The terrain was difficult. Rocky outcrops alternated with areas of dense thickets where every step could end in a cliff. According to Harrison's report, the first attempts to locate the opening yielded only false results. All the cracks where the volunteers went down ended up in blind cavities. On the 3rd day of the search, one of them noticed an unnatural inclination of the stones in the hollow between 2 pine trees. The wind passing through the gap made a short, dull whistle. Following protocol, they carefully dismantled the rubble. A narrow opening opened under a layer of soil and branches, and a chill blew in from it. A temperature measurement showed a significant drop compared to the surface, a typical indicator for karst caves. Harrison gave the signal to prepare for the descent. He and 2 volunteers were the first to enter. The others stayed outside with a radio. The passage turned out to be very narrow. They had to crawl on their knees until the corridor widened. The video recording from Harrison's chest camera, which was later seized by investigators, captures the first few minutes. The light of the flashlight sliding across the walls, the glare of water, then silence, only breaths and footsteps. A few minutes later, they found themselves in a more spacious grotto. The ceiling was arched, the stone was wet, covered with moss in places. On the ground was what they first took to be the remains of an animal. The flashlight shifted the beam, and a human hand became visible, dried out but preserved, like those of old mummies. Harrison radioed to everyone to stay put and began to record the situation. The reports go on to describe 2 bodies sitting side by side, pressed together. One was a younger man, the other an older one. Between them is a metal thermos that has retained its shape. There are scratches on the walls, but not from tools. A closer inspection revealed that these were not accidental scratches, but deliberately carved symbols. They covered the stone with a dense layer, intersecting in places to form complex patterns. The symbols were geometric: triangles, spirals, schemes that resembled nerve fibers or broken stars. No official catalog of petroglyphs has ever recorded such samples. In his first report, Harrison noted that the carving was done with a sharp metal object, presumably a knife or tool fragment. Under the stone were small fragments of quartz that could have been left over from the carving. As for the bodies, the examination later confirmed that they had been lying there for at least 3 years. Due to the stable microclimate of the cave, partial mummification occurred. The skin retained its structure, and the tissues did not decompose completely. Tags with initials that matched those of Cedric Blackmore and Basil Ashdown were found on the clothes. According to one of the volunteers who was present at the discovery, both men's faces looked distorted with fear. There were no signs of a struggle or attempts to escape. No weapons were found nearby, and the equipment was laid out flat, as if someone had been organizing it. When the information reached the Flathead County Sheriff's Department, the area was immediately declared an investigation zone. The entrance to the cave was sealed. The investigative team's report states that the first official inspection was conducted the following morning. In addition to the bodies, several items were seized: a metal flask, the remains of a backpack, and a camera without a memory card. All items were sent for examination. The description of the grotto's condition was made with special attention to the walls. Symbols covered them to the height of a person's height. Some were freshly carved, others were covered with a thin film of moss. It looked as if they had been applied over a long period of time. In the upper part of the vault, they found a sign that was larger than the others: 3 intertwined circles with a vertical line through the center. It was captured in a photo, but no decoding was given. Local geologists, who were hired as consultants, confirmed that the cave was of natural origin. It consists of 3 chambers connected by narrow passages and has only one entrance. Any attempt to leave it without outside help would require ropes or ladders. This meant that those trapped inside had no way out if the passageway collapsed. In an official commentary, Harrison noted that the smell in the cave was different from the usual earthy smell. There was a slight metal flavor. This could be caused by the oxidation of the stone or the presence of foreign substances. The laboratory report on the air samples mentioned an elevated hydrogen sulfide content, but not within critical limits. After the bodies were evacuated, the site was left under surveillance. Brief notes appeared in the press that the remains of 2 missing tourists had been found in Glacier Park. Their names were not disclosed until the examination was completed. Only relatives received preliminary confirmation based on clothing and equipment. For Ava Blackmore, it was the end of the wait, but not relief. She arrived in Kalispell for an official identification. Police reports describe her reaction as restrained, without screaming. She simply said that, now at least she knows where they are. Harrison himself avoided speculation about the circumstances of the death in his subsequent explanations. He emphasized only the facts: no signs of violence, no debris to indicate a fall or trauma, and the presence of unknown symbols made after or shortly before death. The discovery of the bodies turned the archival case into a criminal investigation. Officially, it received a new status: murder under unspecified circumstances. All further actions were transferred to the jurisdiction of the county sheriff. The cave where the bodies were found has since been known only by its working name, Sleeping Bear. Local legends that once seemed ridiculous have now taken on a new life, but in a different, cold way. The symbols on the walls were the beginning of a story that was to explain not only the disappearance, but also something deeper: what happens in the human mind when it is left alone with darkness. October 2018. A new investigation has officially begun at the headquarters of the Flathead County Sheriff in Kalispell. The case, which had been in the archives for 3 years, was transferred to Detective Rebecca Morris. In her official documents, she is described as an analyst with experience investigating in remote areas where evidence quickly disappears in the rain and snow. She arrived in Kalispell with a briefcase and her first order of business: to classify everything related to Sleeping Bear Cave as a crime scene of an undetermined nature. The examination of the bodies lasted several weeks. The forensic medical report, which was later made public in part, indicates 2 main causes of death: dehydration and exhaustion. No signs of violent trauma were found, no bones were broken, and there were no tears in his clothes that could indicate an animal attack. This meant that Cedric Blackmore and Basil Ashdown did not die from external influences, but died slowly, trapped, Forensic experts did not find any fingerprints, and DNA analysis of samples taken from the cave walls showed only traces of the blood of the victims themselves. Samples from clothing gave the same results. Only a metal flask found nearby showed traces of corrosion and moisture residue with a high salt content typical of human sweat. The report defines this as traces of prolonged contact. The symbols were investigated separately. A park forester hired as a consultant confirmed that they do not belong to any known Native American tradition and have no similarities to historical petroglyphs in the region. The carvings were estimated to be no more than 10 years old. Some lines were still sharp with no signs of erosion, while others were covered with a thin film of dust, indicating different times of application. When the results were sent to a laboratory in Missoula, the first hypotheses emerged. Experts in the field of psychological profiling from the Federal Bureau of Investigation concluded that the drawings were a manifestation of the pathological activity of a person with a perception disorder. In the report, they call it the language of the obsessive system, an attempt to create their own scheme for controlling chaos. Such cases are known in criminal practice, but are usually accompanied by social isolation, fanatical work on a project, and a gradual loss of contact with reality. The profiler who worked on the case noted that the author of these symbols is probably a local resident, well-versed in the forest, has basic knowledge of geology, avoids contact, and possibly considers himself a holder of special knowledge. His handwriting in carving the symbols is recognizable, orderly lines with a complete lack of artistic rhythm. It is a combination of discipline and madness. Detective Morris noted in her notes that she was not inclined to mystical explanations. She rejected the suggestion of a ritual and insisted that this was a person who acted within his own belief system. "No one draws in the dark without meaning," she was quoted as saying by one of her colleagues, although the report does not cite this statement. While the experts were working with the materials, Ava Blackmore stayed in Kalispell. She was allowed to view her brother's belongings that were not of evidentiary value. Among the electronic media was his old laptop. According to Ava herself, she noticed one photo in the photo folder that had no date of creation. It showed her brother's garage, a shabby wall, and several dark lines drawn in charcoal. When she enlarged the image, she saw triangles intersecting at an angle, similar to those carved in the cave. She passed this fact on to investigators. The report of the discovery was included in the case file as a new landmark. Digital security experts confirmed that the photo was taken no later than a year before the disappearance. There are no similar symbols in other photos. This was the first confirmation that Cedric Blackmore could have encountered this system of signs before going to the park. Morris made a brief note in her office notes. Accident ruled out. From that point on, the direction of the investigation changed. If earlier the focus was on an unknown attacker who could keep tourists trapped, now they were considering the possibility of an acquaintance between the victim and the future perpetrator. The detective interviewed Cedric's circle of friends, project colleagues, and members of local travel clubs. Most described him as an open and curious person who had a penchant for observing natural forms, taking pictures of relief lines, tree bark structure, and river branches. It was this attention to symmetry that could have attracted him to a man with a similar but pathological obsession. Several people with whom Cedric worked at different times were named in the files, but there was no concrete evidence of a connection to the symbols. Nevertheless, Morris insisted on continuing to analyze Blackmore's personal notes. In his notebook, which was taken from his home, a short phrase was found on the last pages: "Pattern as language." Below it are 3 uneven circles drawn in ink. After that, the first assumptions were made that Cedric was not just a victim, but was involved in some idea or experiment that went out of control. The FBI report submitted to the sheriff's office stated, "There is a high probability that there was a prior intellectual or creative contact between the victims and the unknown perpetrator." This assumption dramatically changed the atmosphere of the investigation. Instead of a faceless criminal acting on the basis of chance, the detectives were faced with a different figure. A person who might have known Cedric personally, a person with whom he could discuss his work, perhaps even trust. When Morris presented the new report to the district attorney, it contained a note in red ink. It is likely that the killer and the victim had a common past. It was this phrase that turned the tide for the entire case. It transformed the story from a wilderness mystery to a story about a human connection that may have turned deadly. January 2019. The frost was stubbornly persistent, and even in the center of Kalispell, the smoke from the chimneys stood still, as if frozen in the air. In the county office, Detective Rebecca Morris was reviewing another batch of documents, this time not from the police archives, but from the University of Missoula. She was looking for any mention of Cedric Blackmore's social circle prior to his disappearance. The investigation entered a phase where traces of the past became more important than evidence of the present. The university archives turned out to be a real repository of memories, lists of students, records of laboratory work, photos from field research. Among the reports of one of the ecology courses were documents of a volunteer program that operated in 2012 and 2013. It was aimed at monitoring water quality in the park's remote lakes. The list of participants included the name of Cedric Blackmore. The minutes of the meeting show that each student worked in pairs. Next to Cedric's name was another name, Elias Cranwick. Until now, this name had never appeared in the case file. It did not appear in the police database nor in the electoral registers. The only source was university records. Over 30 years old, a returning student specializing in natural sciences. The professor with whom the group worked at the time recalled that Cranwick was quiet, reserved, but had a tendency to fixate on details. His projects were noted for their meticulousness, but over time, they began to contain incomprehensible schemes devoid of scientific logic. The report of the university curator states that during his field trips, Cranwick paid special attention to the patterns on the stone surfaces, the branching of algae, and even cracks in the soil. He wrote these structures in a notebook, labeling them natural stabilization patterns. At first, his students perceived this as eccentricity, but later, according to one of them, Cranwick began to talk about the existence of a system of balance that, in his opinion, determined the development of all natural forms. Rebecca Morris recorded all the references to him and sent a request to the local registration authorities. In response, she received a short certificate. Elias Cranwick was born in Washington State, had a degree in engineering, worked as an engineer for a private company, and quit after his wife died in a road accident. After that, he worked odd jobs for several years until he entered the University of Montana as a renewal student. In 2015, he dropped out without giving a reason and disappeared from sight. The detective found this date particularly telling. It was the same year that Cedric and Basil disappeared. In her working notes, this coincidence is marked with a red marker. To test the connection, Morris traveled to Missoula with Ava Blackmore. In the university archives, they were allowed to view the photographs of the volunteer program. Several pictures taken near one of the lakes show Cedric and an older man next to measuring equipment. By comparing them with the identification photos from the personal file, it was confirmed that it was Elias Cranwick. The testimonies of his teachers preserved a brief description: intelligent, disciplined, but prone to philosophical digressions. One of the teachers recalled that Elias often repeated the phrase, "The world falls apart if it is not held together by a formula." At the time, it was perceived as a poetic image, but now it seemed like a harbinger of illness. Morris obtained permission to search the garage that once belonged to Cedric Blackmore. His personal belongings were still stored there. In an old box labeled Lakes, they found a field diary from 2013. The pages were yellowed, but the entries were clear. Among the notes on water samples and temperature, there were strange drawings, circles, spirals, triangles, similar to those carved on the walls of the cave. Under one of the sketches, in small handwriting, there was a signature. Elias was showing his stabilizing signals. Interesting, but a little creepy. This entry was the first direct confirmation of the connection between Cedric and Cranwick. Experts confirmed that the notebook was authentic and belonged to Blackmore. Then the investigation materials included a fragment from the detective's explanation. Cedric probably perceived Cranwick's ideas as scientific eccentricity. He did not realize the potential danger. In the same document, she noted that the nature of Cranwick's university-issued notes indicates a gradual development of obsessive-compulsive disorder. His thoughts increasingly centered around systems and stabilization, to which he attributed almost mythical properties. Subsequent attempts to find Cranwick were unsuccessful. According to social services, he had no official place of residence after leaving the university. His bank accounts are inactive and he has no tax returns. His name disappeared from the voter lists and did not appear in any database after 2015. This disappearance was so complete that some investigators suggested the possibility of death or hermitry in the mountains. Despite the absence of witnesses, the line of communication between him and Cedric was becoming clearer. They had spent several months together in the field, discussing patterns of nature, structure, and form. For Cranwick, this might have been the first person who listened to him. For Cedric, it was a strange but interesting senior friend. Rebecca Morris wrote in another report that there is a pattern in Cranwick's story, an attempt to turn a personal loss into a system that explains the world. After the death of his wife, she said, he tried to organize chaos through signs. It was this desire that could eventually turn into an obsession. A chance encounter with a younger colleague who had an analytical mind and a penchant for research could revive his sense of mission, the desire to pass on his knowledge. And when that contact was cut short, all that remained was an obsession. All of these conclusions were still theoretical, but they gradually outlined the outline of a person capable of isolation, control, and conviction of his own righteousness. From that moment on, Elias Cranwick's name was officially added to the list of possible suspects in the case. March 2019. The snow in the foothills of the Montana forests had already begun to melt, but gray ice strands still lingered higher on the slopes. The roads were souring, and in the mornings, fog would blanket the valleys, making the forest look older than it really was. Detective Rebecca Morris was working with the remnants of old evidence, sheets of paper written in the handwriting of various novices and volunteers who had participated in the search 3.5 years earlier. Among these papers, she noticed a report from a hunter from Flathead County, which was filed as inconsequential at the time. The record said that the man, while collecting traps, came across a strange cabin that he described as a shelter hung with tin cans. He did not stop, did not come closer, only wrote it down in a report that was later lost among hundreds of others. He located the site tentatively behind an old sawmill called Glenmore's Stand. This name did not appear in any official documents, but several old-timers in the town of Aspen Falls confirmed that a small timber processing company had indeed operated in the Deep Valley, but it closed in the 70s. Morris organized a field trip. The group included several officers and a technician from the navigation department. They headed north from Aspen Falls, where the forest was densifying and the road was turning into a narrow path between pine trees. When they got there, the coordinates matched the former industrial site, the remains of a concrete foundation, rusted beams, and stumps that had grown into the ground. Only the ruined walls of the sawmill remained. While inspecting the neighborhood, one of the officers noticed a path leading deep into the grove. It was narrow, trampled in only a few places, as if someone had moved there cautiously and infrequently. The path led to a small, almost ruined hut. The roof was sagging, and tree branches were sprouting through the walls. Near the entrance hung tin cans attached to wires. They rattled in the wind, creating the feeling that someone invisible was watching every movement. The search report indicated that the door was open. Inside, there was semi-darkness. Lanterns illuminated the wooden walls covered with symbols, the same ones that had previously been recorded in the Sleeping Bear Cave. Lines cut with a knife and burned into the wood created a dense web of triangles, spirals, and circles. Some were traced with blood or a substance similar to rust. On the floor were sheets of paper folded in stitches, homemade journals. The paper had yellowed, the ink had spread in some places. Each entry repeated numbers, formulas, and diagrams. The dates were uneven: 2014, 2015, sometimes without a year at all. Experts later determined that they were all written by the same hand. On the table, made of boards, there were shards of glass, pieces of wire, batteries, old binoculars, and a candle that had burned to the bottom. In the corner was a backpack with worn straps and the remains of canned food. All this showed that someone had lived here for a long time, perhaps for years. During a detailed inspection, a metal box was found in the chest under a pile of rags. Inside was a student ID card from the University of Montana in the name of Elias Cranwick. Next to it were a few small items: a knife, a lighter, and a rolled-up photograph. It became the key to understanding everything he saw. In the picture, two men stood by a lake with measuring instruments: Cedric Blackmore and Elias Cranwick. On the back, in ink, was a short inscription: "My only friend, traitor." This inscription was then carefully photographed and attached to the evidence. The description made by the forensic experts shows that the entire hut was a reflection of the disintegration of its owner's consciousness. On the floor, there were stones arranged in circles. On the table, diagrams repeated in a circle, as if he were trying to find a formula that he could not complete. On the shelves were jars of soil, moss, and dried plants. Each jar bore a symbol identical to those on the walls. In her analytical report, Detective Morris noted, "The residence exhibits complete isolation. All signs point to an attempt to organize the world through mechanical repetition of signs." The photograph that was found explained a lot. For Cranwick, Cedric was not just a colleague, he became his listener, a witness to his ideas. In Cranwick's mind, distorted by years of obsessive thoughts, this turned into a connection that he perceived as sacred. When Cedric withdrew from the collaboration, Cranwick might have seen it as a betrayal, a destruction of his own system. Additional entries in his journals confirm this version. One of them contains the phrase, "He no longer sees structure, he laughs as the world tilts." In another, "He has forgotten about stabilization. I have to remind him." The dates on these notes are unclear, but they were probably made after Cranwick left the university. A psychological examination determined that the author of the journals showed signs of paranoid schizophrenia. His text is an attempt to mathematically record chaos, to build an imaginary formula for balance, where each symbol was a pillar of the world. In his latest writings, he writes about a model of resilience, where human actions are labeled as deviations. The investigators who participated in the review noted that the atmosphere of the hut was oppressive. One of the technicians described it as a feeling of someone else's presence after leaving. The experts took pictures of everything down to the smallest detail, including footprints in the dust. Later, they found that some of them belonged to a person who had moved there recently. This meant that the owner could have returned here after a long break. For the investigators, this was irrefutable evidence. Elias Cranwick had lived, or at least been in the area recently. His hut is not a museum of the past, but a place where he returned to. Thus, the found sawmill Glenmore's Stand became not just a geographical point, but the center of the whole story. It contains traces of the past, evidence of obsession, and most importantly, a motive. Not the desire for death, but a distorted desire to understand, and be understood, which turned into fanatical isolation from the world. April 2019. A low fog settled over Lake McDonald every day, and the water seemed like a page from which lines were being erased. After the search of the Glenmore stand, Detective Rebecca Morris abandoned from the raid. In a note, she noted that the suspect thought in terms of structures, so he needed to be brought in. A rumor was spread through the Rangers and several local institutions about the alleged revolutionary notes of Elias Cranwick found in Missoula, which were going to be made public. The bait was to arouse jealousy and desire. Observations near the hut confirmed that there were fresh footprints in the dust, notebooks turned over on the table, pages torn out, and tin cans on wires added in a hurry. A hidden camera captured a thin man with a backpack. He stood in the passage for a long time, as if listening to see if the sequence of the forest was broken. The interception plan identified a location that his logs called Perfectly Balanced, an old fishing shelter on the shores of Lake McDonald. The building had been checked the day before, the windows were boarded up, and 3 connected circles with a dash were knife-edged under the tabletop, a familiar sign. At dawn, when the white curtain was at its thickest, the observation post reported that a figure in a dark jacket had entered the trail and was heading for the shelter. The group dispersed, 2 approaches through juniper and pebbles, leaving the main entrance open, a move that was supposed to be the most stable. The contact occurred shortly after the man crossed the threshold. Fresh scratches were already darkening on the walls. Triangles, spirals, lines searching for a center. According to the officer, he stood in the middle of the room with his back to the entrance, his palms raised as if he was holding an invisible diagram. He did not run away or argue when asked. Witnesses relayed his steady, quiet phrases, similar to theses about signs, sequence, and axis. This was not a confession, rather it was an imposition of order. When asked to put down the knife, he responded without resistance and was then handcuffed. Morris's report calls the moment an anticlimax. No fuss, just a man used to talking to walls of lines and angles. During the inspection, several notebooks with fresh marks were seized, diagrams of balance transfer, references to university pages that would spoil the model. On the floor, they found footprints that matched the footprints in the hut. This connected the dots: a lair, a cave, a shelter. Outside, the fog was thinning. When he was being led out, he did not ask questions, only looked back once at the wall where the raw lines shone. One of the rangers wrote down, "The gaze passed us and stood in a place that did not exist." As a result, the detective recorded that the object was immersed in its own system of meanings, with no awareness of the consequences. The operation was completed without shots and loud scenes. The bait worked where he was looking for the center. The forest gave shelter to his geometry, the water its imprint, the fog its boundaries. What remained was a protocol and a wall with raw lines, a mute but sufficient answer to how an idea replaces life. June 2019. The courtroom in Kalispell is almost completely full. Fans circle slowly under the ceiling, mixing the smell of polished wood with the metal from the partitions. In the dock is a man in light gray button-down clothes with short cropped hair and a pale face. This is Elias Cranwick, accused of the kidnapping and death of 2 people and found unfit to be held in a regular prison. After his arrest, he underwent a multi-week psychiatric examination at the Helena Clinic. The conclusions of the experts were unanimous: paranoid schizophrenia with obsessive-compulsive manifestations. His thinking is systematic but detached from reality. He is convinced that he can stabilize the world through his own system of symbols. The court documents state that his actions were not aimed at causing harm as a goal, but led to death due to manic distortion of cause and effect. He behaved calmly during the hearing. The court reporter's notes show that he was closely watching everyone who spoke, as if he was evaluating them on an unknown scale. His state-appointed defense lawyer repeatedly asked for breaks because the defendant was writing strange combinations of numbers and shapes in a notebook during the discussions, which he then destroyed. At the hearing, when the judge gave him the floor, Krennic did not address the victim's relatives and did not admit guilt. Witnesses recall that his voice was even, calm, and without a shadow of emotion. He began to describe the principle of stabilizing chaos, a process that, in his words, could save the planet from disintegration. He spoke of the geometry of water, the rhythm of mountain fractures, and the structure of nervous systems as part of a single formula. The words were scientific in form, but meaningless in content. The audience in the room felt not anger, but vague horror. They were looking at a man who had completely replaced reality with his own theory. The psychiatrists explained to the court that his behavior was the result of a long-lasting psychosis. He did not realize that he had committed a crime because for him, his actions were part of an experiment. One of the experts, Dr. Fillmore, wrote in his report, "His mind is built like a mechanism of equations. He believes that the death of people is not death, but only a transition to a stable phase." Relatives of Cedric Blackmore and Basil Ashdown were present at the hearing. They did not express emotions, only listened. When it was announced that the defendant was found insane and sent to the Worm Springs Psychiatric Facility for life, the room was silent. The judge delivered the sentence in a steady voice. There was no movement on Cranwick's face. A few days after the trial, he was transported to a facility in the western part of the state. There he is held in isolation, with access to only sheets of paper and a simple pencil. Medical staff reports that he continues to draw his symbols, placing them in a strict sequence on the walls of his cell. That same month, Ava Blackmore returned to Glacier National Park. Together with the rangers, she hiked up to St. Mary's Lake. The wind was warm, the water was calm, and the sky was clear. She opened a metal urn and poured the ashes of her brother and his friend over the water. This moment was witnessed by only one ranger, who later noted, "She stood silently until the ashes melted into the air." Detective Rebecca Morris remained in Kalispell at the time. Officially, she was thanked for solving the case, but in her private notes, she wrote that the investigation left her feeling incomplete. In her report, the last sentence is the phrase, "We proved the causal chain, but did not understand the logic of who created it." Later, the rangers who maintained the area near Sleeping Bear Cave reported that the carvings on the walls were gradually eroding. Moisture from mountain springs and time destroy the lines that once seemed eternal. The stone is darkening, moss covers the triangles, and the circles are blurring. The forest seems to be trying to hide the memory of what happened. The place where the bodies were found is now closed to visitors. On maps, it is marked as a restricted area, but among the locals it is still called the Cave of Silence. There is nothing left there but a shadow on the stones and the feeling that somewhere deep underground there is an echo. All case files are stored in the Kalispell District Court archives under a number beginning with the letter C. FBI reports state that the motives for the crime are unparalleled in recent years. It is described not as a deliberate act of violence, but as an example of a mental collapse in which logic and faith in the system merged into one. This is how the story that began with a photo by the lake and ended in a courtroom ended. Two people who sought nature became its victims. The third, who wanted to organize it, became its anatomist. The forest and water took back what they had, and the symbols that were supposed to stabilize the chaos turned to dust.